Okay, so thank you so much for coming to the Conservation Education Lunch and Learn. I'm going to introduce one of our experts today. I'm so excited. She's going to be speaking about science communication strategies and practices, especially in the age of misinformation that we find ourselves in today. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Taylor Ruth. She is an assistant professor of agriculture and environmental science communication in the Department of Agricultural Leadership, Education, and Communication at University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Her research investigates the intersection of science literacy, agricultural literacy, and media literacy to understand how individuals process complex information related to science. Taylor has a master's degree and a PhD in agricultural education and communication, along with a bachelor's degree in microbiology and cell sciences from the University of Florida. So excited to have her on today. And just as a reminder, as we go through, my name is Amber Schiltz. I'll be the host today. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be watching that, and also make sure that we keep our we keep yourselves on mute. But your videos are welcome. We love to see your lovely faces. Okay, so Taylor, take it away.
Yeah, well, oh, I am muted. Oh, not muted. Always think I'm muted when I start. Well, thank you all for having me. I am very excited to chat with you today about one of my favorite topics, I think, with science communication, which is this online science communication and misinformation that we are seeing and how that impacts the way that we interact with members of the public or our stakeholders. So some of the things we're going to be discussing today, so you know where we are headed with this presentation, describe the challenges related to science communication on these online platforms, discuss how misinformation spreads online, and then hopefully you can walk away with some strategies to communicate science online that is going to be effective and not necessarily you just spinning your wheels. So to kind of get started, I want to talk a little bit about misinformation and the different types of misinformation we might see online. So misinformation can sometimes be harmless. One of these scenarios that comes to mind was last week was the Met Gala, and for whatever reason, somebody decided to Photoshop Jennifer Lopez's face onto Vanessa Hudgens' body, and then it started spreading on TikTok and Instagram and Twitter, as you can see with these comments here, that these two women were wearing the same designer ball gowns. It was completely false. It was just a Photoshop fake. One of my students, because my students know I enjoy fashion and I enjoy pop culture, came up to me and said, "Did you see two people were wearing the same dress?" And I said, "Oh no, that didn't actually happen." And she asked, "Why would people do that?" And I said, "I don't know." Some people just like to be a little bit chaotic, but this is a case of misinformation that really didn't impact people or harm people. So sometimes misinformation can be frivolous and harmless, but sometimes it can be quite harmful as well and dangerous. And we've really seen that, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, how that information was being spread online and how it impacted members of the public and decisions that they were making. It actually became referred to as an infodemic in some cases because there's just so much information out there about COVID-19 and treatments and prevention that people were just overwhelmed with information and weren't always making great choices. There was a case in Iran where people believed that if they consumed this really concentrated alcohol, it could treat COVID, and it led to several hundred deaths. Similarly, in India, there's a TikTok going around saying that if you drank this, I think it was thorn apple seed liquor, that it would also help treat and prevent COVID-19, and it led to hospitalization of adults as well as children. Also thinking about here in the States with ivermectin being a good preventative treatment for COVID-19. I have a horse who actually needs ivermectin to deworm her. And when I went to the store, I couldn't find any because it was sold out. And there are also warning labels everywhere that it's for livestock only. So this misinformation that's being spread online can have actual impacts on people. So like I said, sometimes it can be very harmless, but sometimes it can be quite dangerous. So we need to understand how this information is being spread and what we can do to help engage the public in meaningful conversations about science. So that way they're making decisions with accurate information rather than misinformation. So to help me get to know a little bit about who's on the call today and what information and if you're dealing with and what misinformation you're seeing, I'd love for you to either drop in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself to talk about what misinformation that you've seen online or in the media being shared related to the context of your job and your position. So thinking about any of those instances that you've seen that misinformation shared. Okay, so I've got a message from Sarah talking about how mountain lions are going to eat your dog or child. Sarah, do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
I think there is just some fear that goes around when it comes to wildlife. And so there's a lot of misinformation that, wild animals are going to kill you, they're going to eat you, they're going to eat your dog. And unfortunately, that makes it kind of hard to try to calm people's fear when it's fear-based.
Yeah, fear is a huge thing we're going to talk about, but definitely allows that misinformation to spread really, really quickly. Amber, you're talking about species being good or bad depending on human value. Can you talk about that a little bit in more detail?
A lot of our messaging is trying to just speak to the ecological role that all species play, and in having that kind of that ecological literacy and understanding that, like I see on Facebook all the time, oh, we have an issue with this, a garter snake or raccoons are bad and we don't want them around, or things like that. So just assigning that kind of human value, and where we try to really hit that is with all the species that we have in Nebraska have some kind of ecological value. Like if we got rid of all the snakes in Nebraska, some people would be very happy, but then we would have some problem with rodent population, and that would even maybe harm our agricultural production. And so kind of like putting that back into what role do they play in the ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're kind of assigning, I like how you said, assigning these like human values of good versus bad on these animals that just are part of this larger ecosystem. I'm seeing lots of comments about snakes too. Sean talking about cottonmouth snakes are in Nebraska when they're not. Just how, how does that information get spread to us in the first place? Annie talking about simple distrust of scientists and information discoveries, that things change, which I think is really important to consider too, because as scientists, we know that information evolves, and as we get new information, we make decisions based off of that. But sometimes for the public, it looks like we're flip-flopping, and that kind of comes from this issue of science literacy at the center of it. So I think that's a really good observation as well. So Sarah's also talking about the government's going to take your land, especially if there's endangered species, which is not true. I'm sure there's a lot of misinformation and perceptions related to that as well. And then causation and correlation, Amber is talking about too. Yeah, so there is so many opportunities for misinformation to spread online, and these can have some pretty serious implications on decisions people are making, whether it's purchasing decisions, their personal conservation decisions, or policy, how they're voting on things as well. So it's important for us to understand how this information is spreading and what we can do to hopefully intercept that before it becomes a little bit too big. So I'm going to exit out of this so you can see things. So when thinking about this online communication and why social media matters, it is because over half of Americans are getting their news on social media, either often or sometimes. That is just where they're getting information, especially these younger generations of consumers. That's really where they're getting their news. In some of my classes, I do some informal surveys with them asking, where do you get your news information? And it's always social media. And then I ask, well, who's your source on social media? Because social media is just the platform right, and their source is usually like their mom, their dad, their neighbor, their grandpa. So it's just information being shared from one individual to the next, which can cause some problems, as I'm sure you can guess. And we can see that nearly a third of Americans regularly get their news on Facebook, which is probably not the most reliable source, just knowing how that information can be shared. So I was working with a group of researchers at UNL recently talking about how we need to do social media research. And he was like, well, that's just for young kids. We don't need to do social media research based off of how people talk about viruses online. I was like, we really can't ignore this anymore, because this is a prevalent place for people to learn information. Whether it's good information or bad information can really lead to some detrimental effects down the road, which is why we cannot just ignore this. One of the big issues that we're seeing come out of social media are these echo chambers, confirmation bias, and filter bubbles. And this happens, as I'm sure many of you know, if you are on social media, you're able to essentially curate your own feed, follow people you like, block people you don't like. You can follow certain hashtags, certain accounts that you want to see, and then kind of ignore or mute the rest. While that creates a space that is really enjoyable for us, it can also create some pretty serious issues with how communication is being shared. Because if we start to only follow people with similar political beliefs as us, religious values as us, similar backgrounds, we start to be in these almost echo chambers where all the information within that just gets amplified louder and louder. We believe it to be true, but then you might have some people that are not necessarily in that bubble with you, who have differing views, different opinions that are also valid, and then you're not hearing those. So you're in this completely different reality within that echo chamber that keeps amplifying that opinion without you hearing these others. And that can cause some pretty serious issues, as well as distortions of reality in some ways too. Part of the problem is also our own confirmation bias. If we believe something to be true and we see something that aligns with that thought or that viewpoint, we're going to automatically assume that is true, regardless of if it's not, which can also further amplify that issue. It's also interesting, this term filter bubbles is a little bit newer when thinking about social media, but like I said, you can literally filter out what you don't want to see and ignore that information. So if people don't want to hear from scientists, they do not have to. Conversely, though, sometimes we get into our own scientific bubble or our own like academic bubble where we're all talking with each other about this research that's happening, but not realizing how members of the public or stakeholders are really feeling about these issues too. So while social media has done a fantastic job of connecting all of us, it's also really separated us into these little bubbles or echo chambers, if you will, of information where we believe this group to be the truth holders, to be correct, to be accurate, and we're not hearing a lot of this other information that's out there that might be relevant. There's been some really interesting research using some social media analytics to look at social network analysis, where we're looking at how people are communicating about these different topics and if they're communicating across groups or within groups. So this is looking at different political topics with political ideology, with liberals and conservatives on Twitter. And you can see for the most part, they are just talking with themselves, and there's not a lot of crosstalk happening. And we see that quite often online, especially within Twitter, where people are having conversations, but they're just having conversations with people who already agree with them. So it's kind of a question of how is that actually impacting our ability to communicate with the public or change attitudes or inform attitudes or opinion if we're only talking with ourselves. And I think I saw somebody raise their hand. Did I see that, Amber?
Yeah, Jackie, you have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
No, I don't think so, but I'm on my phone for this Zoom, so I might not be working the controls
Oh,
properly.
no
I'll try to
worries.
lower it down.
No, no worries. You're good.
problem.
That's okay.
I just want to make sure. Thank you.
Just want to make sure I didn't miss anybody. Yeah, so this is always fascinating for me to look at. And then I think it was 2016, 2017, when there was the March for Science happening in DC with all these scientists coming out and basically saying we need to listen to scientists, and looking at how that was communicated online on Twitter. And there were really, I think it was about 3 different groups. One group was scientists talking to each other using the hashtag. One group was news media talking to each other using the hashtag. And the third group was politicians talking to each other using the hashtag. But none of them were sharing across groups or communicating across groups or engaging across those groups either. So when I'm talking about these kind of echo chambers or filter bubbles, it's not just the public doing it, like we're part of that too. And it's something we have to really be cognizant of and considerate of as we move forward with our own communication. So before we start getting into talking about misinformation specifically, I do want to talk about misinformation versus disinformation, because sometimes these are used a little bit interchangeably and they're not quite the same thing. So when we're thinking about misinformation, this is often that like misleading or out of context information that's shared without really the intent to deceive. I think this is what we see most often with science communication, because some people will like cherry pick that data, cherry pick that study, or not specify the study was done in mice. And then people just think that this is the truth. It gets shared, it gets widely picked up by different media outlets or whatever that might be. And it's not meant to deceive, it's a mistake, but it still has some pretty negative impacts down the road. But I would say that is most often what we're seeing with science communication. We do also have disinformation, where it's that purposely false content that is shared with the real intent to deceive people. And this can be done for a variety of reasons, sometimes just for the heck of it, like that Met Gala J-Lo Vanessa Hudgens example I gave at the beginning. But sometimes it can be done with pretty ill intent in mind, especially thinking about with politics and recent elections going on. But there is a difference between those. But I would say for science communication, for the most part, it is people misunderstanding the data, sharing it, or sharing incomplete information with the public. So when we're talking about online misinformation, we can see it can be shared really quickly within these social networks, especially thinking back to those echo chambers where people have those similar values and attitudes. And if you have one prominent person share that information, it can reach so many people who then can share with their followers, and it can just spread like wildfire. And people are often going to be less critical of information that already aligns with their beliefs. So that kind of comes back to that confirmation bias we discussed a few slides ago. So if you see information that is just counter to anything you've ever seen before, you'll be like, well, that's not true, and dismiss it. Similarly, if it's similar to what you believe, you're going to accept it. Now, that information that's counter to anything you've seen before, that might be valid, it might be true, but because it's not congruent with your current beliefs, you might dismiss it, which is not great either. So it's just something we have to be aware of with people when we're communicating with them. The other thing too is it's really difficult to change people's ideas or attitudes about this topic once they hear and believe that misinformation. So thinking back to some of those examples about like the snakes that are in Nebraska that aren't in Nebraska. Once people hear that, they might just latch onto that and be like, no, these snakes are here. I've heard it, I've seen it. And you can give them counter information, but they might dismiss it because they've heard that misinformation first, which makes it really quite challenging. So we have to really think about where people are coming from when they're hearing that misinformation to understand how they're going to be reacting to it as well. And this ties into this idea of latitudes of rejection and acceptance, which is a theory that I did a little bit of research with a few years ago within the context of genetically modified organisms. But it's basically this idea that people hold a certain position about a topic, whether they agree with it or they don't agree with it. And there's a number of positions that they will find acceptable until you get to a group of positions or statements that they don't find acceptable. This is kind of a wonky chart that I pulled from the publication from this, but basically what it's showing is a variety of statements about GMOs ranging from really negative, talking about GMOs can cause cancer in humans. Research doesn't support that, but a fair amount of people do believe that, ranging all the way to GMOs can be used to increase the safety within certain foods. And if we're looking at this, these are all negative statements here, and not surprisingly, people with these negative beliefs found these negative statements to be acceptable. They're fairly non-committal, though, towards these positive statements, except for these people with these extreme beliefs towards GMOs that they can cause cancer. They're rejecting these more positive statements, saying they are going to be safe for consumption, it'll increase the availability of food for me, and increase nutrition of the food as well. They're rejecting that because it is so different from what they believe. And that's what we're seeing with online conversations too. People with these extreme attitudes or extreme beliefs, they're just going to automatically reject any information that is counter to that, which makes that communication very difficult with this type of person. Now, you can still talk with these people with these negative beliefs, and they might be non-committal towards it, but there's a little bit of an opportunity to at least shape those opinions. So that's something that I think we have to consider whenever we're engaging in any type of science communication, whether it's in person or online. These people with these really extreme beliefs, it's very hard to change their mind. So effort is better placed towards these people who maybe don't have as quite extreme beliefs, whether that's extreme beliefs towards science, extreme beliefs towards religion, extreme beliefs towards politics. Those people are just going to be harder to reshape those opinions. So I thought that was kind of interesting to bring up within the context of people rejecting that new information when they've already heard that misinformation.
I have a question on that, Taylor, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I like that you said, just scientifically, maybe efforts are, but if efforts are limited resources, efforts are maybe best placed on the people who might be a little bit more in the wiggle room. But often, I'm sure many of us can agree and understand that often it does feel like we do have to put out fires, and so therefore put our resource of effort more towards those polarized views because they are the loudest. So it feels most salient. It feels like we need to give more of our efforts over there. I don't know. Could you speak to that a bit and how that might play out?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. They are often the loudest, which gives this perception that the public feels this way when in reality, from all the because I've done several different public opinion panels nationally, as well as it was more when I was in Florida, still in the Southeast. The public is pretty neutral towards a topic like GMO. You wouldn't necessarily think that based off of what you see in the media, but they're fairly neutral for a few different reasons. I think mostly they don't actually think about their food that much, but that's a different conversation. But yes, you do have these loud people, these loud voices. And I would say you still need to address those concerns, but you're not necessarily trying to change those people's opinions who are saying those things, but it's putting out your own information, your own content, whether it's through press releases, community engagement events, social media campaigns, that is addressing those concerns that the public might have. So that way you're part of that conversation too. And it's not just these people on the extreme ends being loud, but engaging directly with those really extreme people and those extreme views. I have not seen to be super successful because I have seen some of my colleagues and mentors engage in those conversations online and they just spiral out of control. So there's a way to still address those concerns without necessarily engaging directly with those people, but tailoring those messages though towards those people in what we call the movable middle. Does that answer your question, Amber?
Oh yeah, and now I have 7 more, but I'm going to hold them. That's really good. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So I would like to kind of hear from everybody here why you think misinformation is more compelling than the truth, because we're seeing it be spread online like we talked about. We've already talked a little bit about confirmation bias and how that can cause misinformation is spread as well. But why do you think this misinformation is more compelling than the science and the facts that we have and the research we have backing us? Because I think it is an interesting thing to consider, and it's hard to move forward without thinking about this as well. And you can either drop that in the chat or you can unmute yourself too. So Annie, you're talking about it's easier to understand. It's usually put out there as black and white. If you're able to unmute yourself, would you mind talking about that a little bit more?
I think it goes along with Cody's idea, like people like being right.
Mhm.
I'm not a scientist by training, but I work in a natural science museum. And so kind of always the joke here is if I don't understand it, then they're not communicating it well, because I don't have the background of how to understand the science. That's a good way of saying it. And for me, I'm always wanting them to make it easy to understand, and having to understand that sometimes science is not easy to understand. You have to take a little bit of nuance with it. So I
Yes.
think misinformation happens because if it can be written simply and easily, sometimes it may not be, like you said, it may not be wrong, but you might be not quite getting the full understanding of what you're trying to say.
Yes, I think people, they can grasp onto it and it's easier to remember because often, like you said, it is very simple and it's very simple concepts and simple language. And that's just easier for us to remember, right? Than some super complicated abstract that might come out from a journal instead. Yeah. Let's see what else is in here. Sarah, you talked about how it's often more shocking or interesting or scary than the truth. If you're able to unmute yourself, would you mind elaborating on that as well?
Yeah, I don't know if I can think of a specific one off the top of my head, but it usually is something that's a little bit more catchy. Someone said it's more clickbaity, which I think is true. So they're often going to compile something, really shrink it down to just kind of this punching line. And it's usually like, oh my gosh, no way. When in reality, it's usually just not actually as shocking or scary. But to try to get people to read it, they're going to make it like this really big news story.
Yeah, I teach a class that talks about science in the media, and we always look at some of these news headlines, and one of them is like, smelling farts can cure cancer. And it is such a stretch from like what the actual abstract says to how the newspaper came up with that headline, where it definitely is clickbaity and ridiculous and not a great representation of what the scientists were actually trying to say with like certain gases might help address cancer growth, which is very different than smelling farts can cure cancer. Let's see, what else do we have in here? Misinformation can be a short and complete answer. I think that is so important. Cody, I don't know if you can unmute yourself, but could you talk about that a little bit more before we move on?
Sure. Misinformation is often just really short to the point. If you smell farts, you're not going to get cancer, you're going to cure it. Whereas if you're going to go through that whole article, it's going to take you an hour before you've read it.
Yeah.
Then you have to synthesize it in your brain, and then trying to communicate that to somebody is another 3 hours, depending on their reading level and understanding. So it's a whole lot easier to write an article that says, go smell some farts.
Yeah, and I see Jeremy's also talking about how misinformation can be like positive reassurance or it can be comforting. And then we have this idea of how it can help me answer for questions that we're looking for. Because if you work in science, science is always evolving. It's not necessarily like this is the hard truth. Honestly, people can interpret numbers one way or another too. And science, we learn more every time we replicate studies or we investigate new variables when we're doing our research as well. So science is always evolving, and we're making our recommendations with the best information that we have possible. That is really hard to explain to people who are just trying to understand how to make decisions in their day-to-day life, and to understand, like we talked about earlier, things can change when we learn more information. So sometimes if there's a story that like, this is why this is happening, or this can help you out, people kind of grab onto that and have that hope in there too. And I think somebody else, it looked like it was Amber, was also talking about how this misinformation can also be really compelling and drawn on our emotions, which is so important as well. So I agree, these are things that we're seeing why misinformation can spread so quickly. But I think we need to think about at least some of these things and how we can apply that to science communication too. And not in a manipulative way, but just a misinformation addresses emotions and feelings. Why can't science communication do that too? So I think there's some lessons that can be learned from this. Obviously, not to just oversimplify things, but I think we have to understand why people are latching on to this misinformation, so that way we can be effective in our communication too.
And Taylor, I know Sean had his hand raised.
Oh, okay.
You might want to unmute. Sean, would you like to add a point?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I was just kind of thinking about as far as like clickbait, and, it's easier, people get excited about things that, sound scary or something. I had a lot of that was going on with when the murder hornet became popular clickbait. People would normally see the European hornet, which are in this area. And we, of course, we get a lot of calls that they actually have the murder hornet, which is not what it's called. But that was something that was very clickable, and people jumped on the bandwagon on that one a lot, because murder hornet sounds a lot more exciting, I guess, if you will, than giant Asian hornet. So
yeah, it's a little flashy, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And we'll come back to that in best practices here in a few minutes, but you can take advantage of things that are trending like that with murder hornets. And it might have to do with you having to address use murder hornets in the initial communication, but use that trending tag on Twitter, Instagram, on Facebook, and then be able to communicate, well, here's 5 facts about them. Fact 1, they're actually this, and share the correct name with it instead. So I think that's a really good point. Within journalism, we talk about if it bleeds, it leads within the news. And I think it's the same thing with misinformation, where if it's kind of scary, kind of flashy, people are going to grab onto that. So it's a great discussion. So when I was preparing for this, I came across these 6 degrees of manipulation that a researcher, Linden, put together. And I thought it was really interesting to look at these and to look at how people are creating this misinformation, or more likely this kind of purposeful disinformation online related to these different topics in politics or in science, and going through each of these. So impersonation was one of them. So we're seeing this trend online of people creating fake Twitter accounts for different politicians or celebrities to be able to start sharing information from those accounts. That's why you see those blue checks are verified on Twitter or different social media platforms, because people are starting to impersonate these thought leaders or opinion leaders to try to sway opinion. Also drawing upon conspiracy theories. People love a good conspiracy to try to explain what is happening. Whenever I see comments about Epstein online, I never know where those are going to go, because there's so many conspiracies related to his death. But conspiracy is a big thing. But then one of the biggest ones on here is this idea of emotion, in my opinion. And we brought this up quite a bit during our discussion just then, where this misinformation does draw upon people's emotion. Oftentimes those emotions are feeling scared or feeling frightened, like somebody mentioned in the chat. So that misinformation can sometimes fuel that fear even more to make them hyper aware of different things, or it can help make them feel better or safer as well. Neither of those are really great in the long run, but that emotion is very important. Also within this misinformation, disinformation, you see polarization where they might be othering different groups and blaming it on different groups of people. Within science, I think we see this more so towards like scientists and not trusting scientists and not trusting higher education and academia and these ivory towers. Also discrediting, you can see this quite a bit as well. I worked with a faculty member at Florida who he gave a number of talks related to GMOs around the country, and people were asking, like, are you funded? Like, who's paying you to do this? And he said, I don't have any funding from like Monsanto or DuPont or Pioneer. But then it came out that he had a small bit of funding from, I think it was Monsanto. So then he became like a Monsanto shill, and they start to discredit this horticulture professor because of that small amount of funding in the world of academia, at least, for him to go around giving these talks and basically discrediting the scientific information he was sharing. And then you just have straight trolling where people are just trying to just mess with people online and share that fake information. But I think for us with science communication, this emotional piece is really important for us to consider, as well as this discrediting part as well, because we can build our credibility if we do it strategically, and not just rely on like, well, I have an MS or I have a PhD after my name. That we can build credibility in different ways beyond just our degree. So we're going to talk about that a little bit too. When thinking about who is most susceptible to misinformation, people with lower levels of education are going to be more susceptible, is what they found in the research, just simply because maybe they don't have the knowledge base to understand if the information they're seeing is accurate or inaccurate. Also, I found this a little interesting. Older generations are more likely to share misinformation online, but they're less likely to believe it, which I can confirm checks out. My dad does not believe almost anything he sees online, which is just as bad as if you believe everything, in all honesty. But they're more likely to share that misinformation, which is also not great. But then you see these younger generations where they're more likely to actually believe that misinformation. So they're believing information they're seeing online at face value, but they're not necessarily engaging with sharing it online either. So I think those are some important considerations for you to take into account whenever you're developing your own communication and thinking about who you're communicating with. Thinking about what makes people susceptible to this misinformation that we see online, I think we just have to realize we are constantly taking in information all day. We are seeing information on our phone, on the TV, web ads, posters. There's information all the time. There's no way we could possibly give the same amount of thought to every piece of information that we see. So when we're thinking about communication theory, we're just going to talk about one really briefly. Our motivation, or how relevant that information is to us, and our ability or our knowledge about this topic is going to be really predictive of our elaboration when we see information. We're talking about elaboration. This is the level of thought and consideration we give to that information. So if we have high levels of motivation, it's very relevant to us. And if we have a lot of knowledge about this, we're going to consider it a lot more than if we don't. And this aligns with the elaboration likelihood model, which is a theory we look at for attitude change within science communication. And this might sound familiar to some of you, but you might have heard different terms used for this, but it's basically this dual processing model of communication. So if we get communication and it is personally relevant, we are highly motivated, we have the ability to understand it, we're going to really thoughtfully consider this information, highly elaborate on it, and then experience changes in attitude that are going to be long lasting and predictive of behavior. More often than not, we're either not going to find the information relevant, or perhaps we're not going to have a lot of knowledge about it. So we're not going to elaborate a lot on that information, and we're going to rely on peripheral cues and go through this peripheral processing instead, where we have these small shifts in attitude that don't last for a super long time and are not always predictive of our behavior in the future. So when you're thinking about even communication you've seen today, some things might really catch your attention. You really think about them because they're relevant. You understand what's being talked about. Other things, you're like, this doesn't really matter to me quite as much, or I don't have the knowledge to fully process this either. But when we go through that peripheral processing, we rely on peripheral cues. So this can include our source information. So how credible is this source relaying the information, familiarity, attractiveness, what imagery is being used, and what messaging is being shared. And thinking about miscommunication or misinformation, sorry, oftentimes they might use a source of information to try to gain trust, or they might use images to evoke emotions because they know people are using this peripheral cue because they don't have the ability or motivation to really thoughtfully consider this misinformation that they are receiving. And we've seen this within ag and natural resources research that people mostly use that peripheral processing route because they simply don't have the knowledge to fully understand what is happening within agricultural and natural resource topics. And some of the research that I've done, we've seen that attitude is more predictive, their prior attitude is more predictive of changes in attitude than their prior knowledge. So attitude is more important than knowledge, which I think is challenging for some people to come to terms with science communication, because we want to just share the facts, but that's not always what's as relevant. And people with less knowledge are going to be using less elaboration, relying on those peripheral cues like images, message frames, as well as sources. And people are selectively paying attention to messages that align with their own values, which is what can help really spread that misinformation in the first place. So I think this is a really relevant theory to consider when we're communicating with others, especially within your context with wildlife and conservation, because people might not have the knowledge to fully process it. So we have to think about what are those peripheral cues to help shape that attitude instead. So how can we overcome the spread of misinformation? I'm actually just going to hop into my next little set of slides here as best practices, because we've had such a great conversation. This time is going by very fast. But I want to talk about how we can overcome that misinformation strategies we can use, especially when engaging on social media. So when we are engaging online, we want to make sure we're doing a few things so it's not just a haphazard online communication to see what happens. So first and foremost, defining our goals and what we're wanting to communicate, and having specific goals for different campaigns, as well as identifying your audience and who you are trying to communicate with. Now, sometimes this might be flipped where you know your audience you need to communicate with and then define your goals. But sometimes it might be, let's figure out what this campaign is about and then identify our audience for who is going to be the most impactful to communicate with. Thinking back to our earlier conversation with that movable middle, in that case, that might be your audience who you're trying to target. Also, making sure you're selecting your social media based on the goals of your audience, creating content and messaging strategy that's going to be effective, and then building your own identity online so you can establish that credibility with your audience. They can trust the information that is actually coming from you. So we're going to go through these a little quickly here. With our goals and our objectives, the goals are going to be your long-term, big picture thing that you're trying to get across to your audience. The objectives are going to be those small steps to reach those goals. Within social media, I think it's really helpful to think about your objectives in terms of your engagement. So your likes, your comments, your shares, as well as your reach or your impressions. So how many people are actually viewing that content. I think I saw earlier this year, you might have had some evaluation talks as well. So this probably all sounds very familiar, but it's helpful to look at these objectives and have these metrics ahead of time so you can figure out, well, what type of communication is the most impactful online? Is it videos? Is it my Instagram stories? Is it a TikTok? What is going to be the most engaging? So identifying those early on is going to help. But then getting into identifying your target audience. With social media, you can be hyper specific with who you are trying to target and who you are trying to reach, which I think is really great because it allows you to create really specific content for those groups of individuals to make it really tailored towards their own needs and their own questions and their own beliefs. I say this to my students, and I'll say this to this group as well. I really encourage people to not say your audience is just the public or consumers, because there's so many different types of people within that group. So being really specific with who you're trying to communicate with, so that way you can choose messages and images that are really going to resonate with those groups. Once you've figured out who that audience is, breaking it down to their demographics, which are pretty straightforward, so age, race, gender, and income, as well as psychographics, so their values, religion, experiences, and beliefs. We've talked a lot about emotion today, so the psychographic part, I think, can get left out sometimes when we're doing our audience analysis, but it is so important at this point. We have to make sure we are considering it. And one of the things I find really helpful when I'm figuring out who my target audience is for any type of communication, rather than thinking broadly, think specific. Think about a very specific person and what those demographics are and what those psychographics are. So like for a young mother, this might be somebody who's concerned with family, values nutrition and health, enjoys being outdoors, yoga, she's a Lululemon mom, she shops at Trader Joe's. You can get really specific, and then you can really tailor that content to that person. So that's gonna be very different than your Midwest dad who likes to go grilling and ice fishing, tornado watcher, highly religious. They're going to interact with different content and be on different platforms as well. When you're thinking about your target audience, choose the platforms where they're going to be the most active, create messaging that is going to be tailored to them, and then build a credible identity for yourself too that's going to resonate with that audience. So when we're thinking about types of online communication, I'll just go through this part quickly because I think this isn't quite as relevant as my next few slides. You have your websites, blogs, and social media. I see a lot of scientists say, I'm going to create a blog, and that's how I'm going to communicate with my audience. Well, how's your audience finding your blog? Oftentimes, these are people who are going to be highly engaged in science and seeking this information already. So blogs can be a great place for conversation and informal science communication, but it can also be limiting because your audience is people with similar values and beliefs to your own. That just reinforces those echo chambers we discussed earlier. Websites can really help establish your credibility, but social media is where you're going to be able to engage with people who you might not be engaging with already, reach a broader audience, and build relationships as well. So social media, I think, is a really important place we have to consider and not to overlook, because we can't always control how those conversations may go. Let's get these here. When you're choosing the platforms, really think about how your audience is using those platforms too. I use Twitter for information. I use TikTok for entertainment, and I use Facebook to really just stay connected with my family. So you wouldn't want to be sharing just straight information through, a TikTok video that you might create, because that's not what people are going to that platform for. So if you're wanting to engage, you want to make sure you're meeting their needs. Also thinking about Facebook. The Facebook pages can be a great place for like citizen science activities. So if you're having people identify birds in a certain area, you can create a Facebook page for people to be on. But if you're wanting to share information broadly, then Twitter is probably going to be a better bet for you. So really being strategic about that platform choice and not just randomly choosing one and going with it. And you might have to tailor your message across the different platforms too. I'm going to just skip over this really quick, but we've done some research looking at messaging, and it just kind of comes back to making sure we understand who our audience is and who we're communicating with. This was some research we did related to Florida citrus, trying to combat citrus greening, which is a bacterial disease right now that Florida is being hit with pretty bad, but looking at how to communicate with the public about this and about a treatment. The Florida Department of Citrus wanted to say, like, this is going to keep us profitable and save the industry. We're like, we should probably talk about more of a family value approach with this communication instead that's going to resonate more. And that's what we found in our research, was that people, of course, liked the message that talked about drinking orange juice with my family rather than keeping the citrus industry profitable in Florida, especially when we went to places like Baltimore, Chicago. They're like, I don't really care if the citrus industry is profitable. So coming back to thinking about who is your audience and what do they care about. When we are communicating with the public, we really need to think about how they are receiving information. As researchers, we often use this kind of inverted triangle for communication, where we start really broad with information and then work our way down to the results and the conclusions. But when we're communicating with the public, it needs to start out very specific. What is the bottom line? How does this impact the public? Why does this matter to them? And then provide those supporting details. So it's kind of flipping that script, which can be a little bit awkward at first, especially if you're used to writing in this structure, but this is going to be a lot more impactful when talking with the public. So when you are crafting your message, these are just a few kind of best tips for you to think through. Really let your audience be the guide. I'm sure you all get questions all the time about your work. Create your social media post or your communication around those questions. Try to get ahead of that. Try to answer those questions and be clear with your responses. Really think about what key information does your audience care about, so that way you can resonate with them, resonate with those feelings, those attitudes, and those beliefs, and then stay consistent across platforms too. So that way they're seeing that message in multiple places. That reiteration is going to help them really stick that information in their mind as well. Also, join conversations and hashtags that are already trending. Thinking back to that murder hornet conversation we had earlier, you can take advantage of those types of things where it could be a crisis communication situation or risk information situation, but you can get ahead of that by joining that conversation and sharing accurate and relevant information. And then also pay attention to your analytics. What types of posts are getting the most engagement? Is it when you have certain scientists that you're tagging? Is it when you're using videos versus pictures versus text? But really pay attention to those analytics too. So that way you're making decisions that are driven by data that you do have. And then just thinking about those peripheral cues. So partnering with different sources that your audience is going to trust is going to help make that communication more effective. And then with building your online identity, there's a few steps that you can take. You as an individual can, of course, put your affiliation within any of your social media bios, so that way people know that you are a credible source of information, but also making sure you're engaging in conversations, you're sharing information, and you're building those relationships online so people know to trust you. So when you're sharing information, they know that it's not misinformation and they can trust it. And then they can also share it with their groups of people too. And that's how we can start to slowly break through these different echo chambers and filter bubbles, is through this relationship building and sharing of content. We're running low on time, so I'm going to skip through some of these things. I can share this with Amber, though, to share out with everybody. Really, the last thing I really want to hit home on before we wrap up today, navigating these difficult conversations online. Oftentimes when I talk to people about online communications, they're like, "Ooh, I don't want to do that. That seems very dangerous." And it can be quite challenging. But one thing I want you to remember is that we have to address people's feelings before we can address anything else. In science, we used to really use this deficit model approach where we thought if people just had more information, they would make good decisions. That is very clearly not the case after what we've seen over the past 2 years. So we cannot use this model anymore for science communication. We have to consider where people's concerns are coming from, where those misunderstandings are stemming from, and address those, and ask questions before we just start providing more facts. And that's really the only way we're going to be able to move forward. And also, I tell my students this too, it's okay to walk away. There's no good comes from having an all-out fight on Twitter, especially with people in those really, really extreme views. It's going to be very hard to change their opinions. But those are just some of those best practices that I wanted to get across. But I think at the end of the day, just remembering we have to address people's emotions, their needs, their values and their beliefs, and we can't just throw facts and figures and stats at them and hope that that's going to make them more accepting of science. And I did not leave nearly as much time for questions as I meant to, so I apologize. My email is here if you want to talk with me afterwards, but I'll open up to questions now if you have any, and I can hang on a little bit later too.
Oh, Taylor, that's okay. Because you did, this was incredible. This was so much information. I was trying to take notes and
I talked more than I thought I would.
no, it was fantastic. Really good. Let's see. Sarah asked, she said, such good information for best practices, Taylor. Thank you. Addressing emotions is real. Facts don't change minds, unfortunately. Yep. Yeah, that's something that seems to be really becoming apparent over the last few years.
Yes.
Is how important that is. Are there any other questions for Sarah? I know she shared a lot, or I'm sorry, Taylor. I know she shared so much great information. Any other questions? We have a little time if you do have them. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Taylor. If you don't mind sharing your PowerPoint, I will certainly include it in that follow-up email if that's okay.
Yep, I definitely can do that.
Amazing. And maybe some of those resources, I'll try to find some of the things that you shared and also share that. So again, I'm going to send out an email to everyone who participated today with an evaluation. I really appreciate your feedback of what you learned, if this is helpful, what other kind of topics you're interested in learning about in this series. And also remember next month in June, we're going to be learning, we're going to be hearing from the director of Ruth Staples Child Development Center at UNL, and she's going to be speaking to the value and importance of early childhood education, both for the child and society. And maybe there's going to be some plugins to some of the things that you discussed today too, how important it is to share that information with people. Okay, thank you so much again, Taylor, and thanks everyone for participating.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.